Imagine being born into a world where your worth is measured not by your dreams, your strength, or your voice, but by how much silver your father can trade you for. Imagine the first man who touches your hand isn't a lover, but a buyer. And imagine being sold off by your own family before you even know what love, safety, or freedom means. This isn't fiction. This isn't just some ancient folktale buried in dusty books. This was the brutal reality for countless women in the medieval world. A world where daughters were currency, a world where marriage was a marketplace, and a girl's life was often signed away before she ever had a chance to live it. Today we uncover a dark and chilling truth. This is Sold by Her Family, the market of women in medieval times. The Middle Ages, romanticized by tales of knights and castles, grand banquets and chivalry. But beneath the glitter of courtly love and shining armor, there was a market that no one talks about. A silent, unspoken economy, where women were the goods. This wasn't just about forced marriages. It was about survival, it was about power, and it was about control. We're not telling the story of one woman. We're telling the story of millions across villages and cities across Europe and beyond. Women who were born into a system that saw them not as people but as property, and many of them, they were sold by the very people meant to protect them, their families. In medieval times, having a daughter wasn't a joyous occasion for every family. To many fathers, she was a future expense, or worse, a liability. Because unlike sons, daughters couldn't pass on a family name. They couldn't inherit land. They didn't bring in revenue. They weren't taught trades. Instead, a daughter meant a future dowry, a payment that her father would owe to another man just to see her married off. And if that family was poor, and many were, the solution became chillingly simple. Marry her young, marry her fast, marry her cheap, or sell her off like livestock. Sometimes it was disguised in the name of marriage. Other times it wasn't even hidden. A peasant girl in 12th century France might be promised to a landowner 3 times her age for a bag of wheat. A merchant's daughter in Italy could be transferred to a creditor in place of a financial debt. In parts of Eastern Europe, girls were exchanged as bargaining chips to settle family feuds. The father got peace, or payment. The daughter lost everything. Let's be clear, marriage in medieval times was rarely about love. For the elite, it was about politics. For the poor, it was about survival. To many, a young girl's wedding day wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction. And while the church claimed marriage was sacred behind closed doors, it often resembled a contract. One signed not by the bride, but by the men around her. She was sold with the same cold logic as one would sell land or cattle. The younger she was, the more desirable. Virginity was prized not for purity, but for property. A virgin was untouched, untainted, valuable. In England, records show girls as young as 12 were married off, some even younger in remote regions. Once given, the girl's body, labor and silence became her husband's right. And if she resisted, that wasn't just frowned upon, it was punished. Not every family was cruel. Many were simply desperate. Picture a small muddy village in 14th century Poland. A father, beaten down by famine, sees his crops fail year after year. He has 6 children, 3 of them girls. He doesn't want to hurt them, but he also can't feed them. So, when a traveling merchant offers a price for his middle daughter, just 13, he sees no way out. He takes the money. The daughter is gone the next morning. This was the quiet reality for thousands. The sale wasn't always done in anger. Sometimes it was done in tears, but the result was the same. She was gone and she wasn't coming back. Beyond the private exchanges, there were actual markets. Yes, actual open-air markets, where women and girls were displayed and traded. In parts of medieval Spain and the Middle East, public auctions of women weren't uncommon, especially in times of war or political collapse. Captured women, often peasants or widows, were stripped of their clothes, their rights, their names. They were sold into slavery, brothels, or forced marriages with no escape. Some were sold across borders, shipped to foreign lands where they didn't speak the language and had no one to turn to. Others were branded, claimed, and many died before reaching adulthood. This wasn't just a medieval problem. It was a human crisis, dressed in period clothing. Not every sale ended in marriage. Some girls, especially those considered unmarriageable or too expensive to wed off, were sent to nunneries, But don't let the cloisters fool you, this was often a different kind of transaction. In wealthier families, a dowry still had to be paid to the church. If the father paid well, his daughter became a nun, sometimes against her will. If he didn't, she could be left in servitude or worse. One 15-year-old girl from Bruges was promised to a convent. She begged her father to let her stay. His reply, "You have no choice. Your future belongs to God now." But God hadn't asked her. The truth, she had simply been sold to a different kind of master. Despite all of this, not every woman stayed silent. There were rebels, fighters, survivors. One record tells of a girl in 13th century Normandy who escaped her forced marriage and fled to a nearby abbey, seeking sanctuary. Another speaks of a woman in Venice who saved for years to buy her own freedom after being sold into servitude as a child. Some women banded together, secretly teaching each other how to read, how to speak, how to survive. Their names are mostly lost to history, but their resistance is not. Because even in the darkest corners of this market, there were sparks of light, and those sparks would one day become flames. The market of women in medieval times wasn't built in a day, and it didn't vanish overnight. It was built into law, into religion, into tradition. But most heartbreakingly, it was built into families. They were sold, traded, married off, or cloistered, not because they were weak, but because the system was. A system built to protect the powerful and silence the rest. But what happened after the sale? Let's talk about the aftermath. The life these women lived after the deal was done. Because the truth is, the sale wasn't the end of their suffering. Often it was just the beginning. Once a girl was handed over, whether for coins, land, peace, or favor, her life became one of servitude wrapped in the illusion of marriage. Her voice? Gone. Her body? Not hers. Her future? Already decided. For many, especially those married into poverty or peasant families, their days became a never-ending cycle of labor, childbirth, and silence. She might be expected to give birth to 10, even 15 children starting from her early teens. Many died in childbirth, without a midwife, without pain relief, and often without anyone listening to their cries. The psychological scars weren't spoken about back then, but they were real. A woman might spend decades under the control of a husband who saw her not as a partner, but as property. Beatings were common. Rape within marriage was never acknowledged. The church even taught that obedience to one's husband was divine. Love had nothing to do with it. Consent didn't exist. And for many of these women, the only escape was death, or outliving the man who bought them. You'd think someone would have stepped in, that someone would have spoken up for these girls. But the medieval legal system was built to favor men, especially landowners, noblemen, and heads of households. If a woman tried to run away from a forced marriage, she could be arrested. If she refused the union, she might be beaten by her husband or her own father. And if she took her own fate into her hands, refusing to consummate the marriage or seeking protection from the church, she'd often be labeled disobedient, sinful, even mad. Because in the eyes of the law, she wasn't a victim. She was property refusing to obey its new owner. Some might ask, what about the mothers? Didn't they protest? Didn't they step in? Sometimes they did. Quietly, tearfully. But mothers in medieval times had even less power than their daughters. A woman had no legal rights over her children. The father was the sole authority. His word was law. If a mother opposed the sale or marriage of her daughter, she risked punishment herself, beatings, exile, or being cast aside. Some tried to help in subtle ways, hiding daughters, delaying marriage negotiations, secretly teaching them how to read or survive. But these acts of rebellion were few and dangerous. Many mothers stood by helplessly as their daughters were sold, praying silently for their survival. Others, hardened by years of the same fate, passed on the pain, believing it was simply the way of the world. A cruel tradition wrapped in silence. Across Europe and parts of Asia and the Middle East, the customs varied slightly, but the core reality stayed the same. In feudal Japan, young girls from poor families were sold to brothels or acting troupes, sometimes under the guise of training them for geisha life. In the Ottoman Empire, Christian girls were taken in raids, sold to noble families or into harems, stripped of their names, their identities, their past. In Eastern Europe, peasant girls were used to sealed trade agreements, married off to traveling merchants or soldiers to secure roots and protection. Whether in castles or mud huts, cities or countryside, the theme was constant. A girl's fate wasn't hers. Her body was a transaction. And her soul? Often the cost of the deal. Still, in the dark corners of history, we find sparks of courage, acts of rebellion, small, quiet, and powerful. Some women, once widowed, refused to remarry. They chose poverty over ownership, and in doing so, carved out rare independence. Others became midwives or herbalists, using knowledge passed secretly from woman to woman. They healed others. They protected girls. They became the backbone of communities. In Germany, a few brave women banded together to form widow guilds, support groups that helped each other survive in a society that saw them as expendable. Some fled to cities, disguised themselves as men, or joined traveling troops to escape forced marriages. Their stories didn't make the chronicles. They weren't written in gilded books, but they existed, and they mattered. The church played a strange double role. On one hand, it promoted the idea of marriage as sacred. On the other, it often turned a blind eye to abuses. Priests would perform marriages where the bride was barely a teenager. They rarely asked for consent. Some abbeys gave refuge, but only if the woman renounced the world completely. Others exploited the ain't women who came to them, using their labor without offering true safety. Still, a few holy women tried to change the tide. In 13th century France, a nun named Eloise wrote letters condemning the forced marriages of girls, calling them prisons of the soul. Her voice was quiet, but it wasn't alone. Over the centuries, women inside the church would become advocates, challenging laws, questioning traditions, and planting seeds that would later bloom into reform. So what does this all mean today? Why revisit these stories, these painful truths of girls sold by their families centuries ago? Because echoes of that market still exist. Because women today are still sold into marriages, into trafficking, into systems that treat them as currency. Because in some places, dowries are still demanded. Because in some homes, daughters are still seen as burdens. Because the silence still exists, but also because the resistance still lives. Every girl who speaks out, every woman who refuses to be bought, every mother who teaches her daughter that she's not for sale, they carry the legacy of those unnamed women who endured, who fought quietly, who survived. We owe them remembrance. We owe them truth. And we owe them the promise that their stories weren't in vain. They were never just wives, never just daughters, never just victims. They were women with names we never knew, with dreams that were never heard, with lives that were stolen before they began. And yet, they endured. In every village, in every kingdom, in every dusty record that dares to forget their pain. We remember them now, not just with words, but with awareness, because history isn't just dates and kings and battles. It's also the quiet, painful truth of girls who were sold by the hands that once rocked their cradle. Let's not romanticize the past. Let's tell it as it was. And let's honor the women who had no voice by never staying silent ourselves. This was Sold by Her Family, the market of women in thine medieval times. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it, talk about it, because some truths need to be heard, no matter how many centuries have passed.